All right, welcome to Rod Dreher's The General Eclectic Podcast. I'm your host, Kale Zelden, and we are here to talk culture, politics, ideas, and faith. Many of you know Rod from his blog at The American Conservative or his three New York Times bestseller books. And so today we are trying out a new podcast for the new year. Thank you for joining. My name is Kale Zelden, and I have known Rod remotely and in person for quite some time. We've corresponded way back in the early 2000s. And so we are going to talk today about those ideas. So, Rod, today in your blog, you were talking sort of around what's going on the national scene. You know, neither of us are particularly enthused or animated by electoral politics, but we should both point out that today the race for the Senate is afoot in Georgia. Any thoughts on that before we get going?
Well, this is a hugely important race, certainly for conservatives, because, you know, we have a Democratic House, an incoming Democratic president, and if Joe Biden were to have a fully Democratic Congress behind him, you know, he could do a lot of harm to the things that people like me and you care about, religious liberty chief among them. And so it's important that the Republicans maintain the Senate, but President Trump has behaved in such a way since Election Day that I think he's going to depress the vote in Georgia, and we could very well see the Senate flip to the Democrats, which is just, you know, I'm so frustrated by it because I'm not somebody who, as you alluded to, who places so much value on electoral politics. But we saw having a Republican president and a Republican Senate, what value that was in terms of the Supreme Court in President Trump's term. So if we lose the Senate this time, we, meaning the conservatives, then there's going to be a big price to be paid. And I think it was will have been such an unnecessary loss.
You know, Rod, you often talk about the word apocalypse, and that the apocalypse is not only sort of like the end of things, but perhaps more to the point, it's an unveiling and an unmasking, a revelation of sorts. What has happened, you know, since that November day for you in terms of what has been revealed to you about the scene and the situation?
Wow, you know, for me the most sobering and depressing revelation has been the way so many conservatives, and especially Christian conservatives, have bought into what the French Protestant thinker Jacques Ellul called the political illusion, which is to say the idea that politics, that life is politics. Politics is the most important thing in life. Therefore, if we just get politics straight, then everything will be solved. And I think it's false. But we've seen so many Christians, especially, rally around President Trump and embrace things that I think are really just not true. They're lies, and they're being embraced out of a sense of fear and a sense of if the Democrats win, then all is lost. I do think, as I said earlier, that it's a big deal if the Republicans lose the Senate. But this idea that so many in the church have that everything depends on politics is very destructive, in part because we are ignoring all the things that actually change culture.
Right.
You know, I mentioned in my blog earlier today, talking about the tacit regime we have, the regime that governs values, that governs cultural change, that has nothing to do with politics at all, but it's happening anyway. In the church, maybe it's something you see in your work as a teacher, you know, with teenagers, so with the way the culture works. There's nothing to do with politics, but it is actively changing society.
Yeah, you know, I'm struck as you're talking about Ellul's notion here of political illusion. Two questions I guess I have for you. From whence the illusion, I guess, is my first question. And secondly, you know, what does the illusion serve in your way of thinking here?
Mm.
So where does it come from,
Yeah.
and what does it do?
Well, I think partly it is constructed by our media. I can remember when I was working at the New York Post, Kale, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was a columnist. And
Yeah.
I remember going to my editor on the city desk and proposing a column for the next day, having something to do with evangelical Christians in New York. And he said to me, he goes, you don't get it. New York is a secular town. It's not a religious town.
Yeah.
Well, I realized that for this guy, he lived in my same neighborhood in Brooklyn, and he would have to walk past churches and two synagogues and a mosque to get to the subway, but they were invisible to him.
Yeah.
The only reason religion mattered at all to this city editor was politically, like what is Cardinal O'Connor saying and how is it going to affect the political scene, or what are the Hasidic Jews of Brooklyn doing, that sort of thing.
Sure.
Well, I think our media frame politics as being all important because that's how they understand the world politically. And even conservatives who look down on the media for distorting things, we buy into the same mindset. I remember once, Kale, back in the 90s, I talked to a journalist friend of mine. We were just starting out, and she said that she used to think that politics was the most important thing happening. But then she moved off the politics beat, got assigned to write about the currency markets for a financial news service. And she said it just blew her mind to see how powerful the currency markets were and how politics seemed very small compared to the actual movements between nations of the currency markets. Well, I think that the currency markets aren't sexy. And to a lot of people who set up the newsrooms, religion isn't sexy, culture isn't sexy. And so they try to interpret it in ways they understand. We bought into that too. Yeah. And what does it serve? It serves actually to disempower the church within church circles. And what do I mean by that?
Yeah.
I mean that, we don't see, when I say the church, I'm talking about not just priests and pastors, but fathers, mothers, people in the church. Our eyes are trained to look at politics and to look at what's going on with the Supreme Court and what's going on with the elected officials.
Yeah, the horse race stuff, right? The horse race stuff.
Yeah, horse race stuff. And we're completely blind to things that are happening in our own lives. I'll give you an example from where I live. I live in Baton Rouge. Yeah. And right now at LSU, Louisiana State, my alma mater, there's a move. There's a move afoot by some left-wing professors with the support of the college administration to radicalize students, to make them take a quote-unquote anti-racist course in order to graduate.
Right.
Well, we know what this is. This is not the history. This is not Black history. This is a strongly ideological course. Yeah. But how many people in this ruby red state in which I live care that much about that sort of thing? They're so focused on national politics that they're ignoring something really important that's happening locally.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I'm a sports fan. I like football a good bit, and I follow it closely, both college and pro. Go Tigers, who dat. But I sort of know what it is, right? I mean, it's this thing that I do. It's fun to pull for my team, and then you can put on the team colors, and it's a sport, and yet I find it so very similar. The way that people talk, about the New England Patriots or the Boston Red Sox or the Chicago Cubs or whatever, the New Orleans Saints, it's eerily similar to the way that we talk about politics, and yet, we know that politics is, actually pretty important. But it's almost like it's the way that we frame politics and the way that we talk politics that actually sort of disallows us from taking it in its proper way.
Yeah, well, it's performative. This is one thing I've never understood about the affection so many people have for President Trump. Mm-hmm. They'll say, for all his problems, he fights. Yeah, but he doesn't win, or he rarely wins.
Well, if I could interrupt there, I mean, I think that from a conservative standpoint, the things that a conservative can look back upon the Trump administration with and legitimately smile is seems to be all of those things that don't register on the sort of the rank and file Trump fanboy radar screen. I mean, you've talked a lot in your blog about the judiciary. You've talked on your blog about, he hasn't started any foreign wars. And, you and I have talked about the fact that he's actually seems to have done some pretty amazing things in the Middle East. But nobody talks about that stuff. I mean, those are actually pretty consequential things. But instead we're treated to, his Twitter habit and fair enough. I mean, it's nuts.
Yeah.
It's nuts.
I kind of think that it's not just a Trump phenomenon. Think about how powerful Twitter is. We've seen in the past few weeks, major institutions do really jump through flaming hoops to satisfy people who complain on Twitter. I wrote on my blog about Mark Crispin Miller, a pretty far left-wing professor at NYU.
Yeah, at NYU. Yeah.
Right. He gets one complaint from somebody on Twitter who tweeted at his faculty made a false accusation against him, saying he was telling people don't wear masks. And now he's facing, they're trying to drum him out of the university, fellow faculty members, and he's had to sue them. What blows my mind is this is one complaint on Twitter, just one. This has happened also with some companies. I think Target got a secret complaint from some trans person on Twitter, and they pulled a certain product off the shelves and finally put it back after backlash.
Oh, it was Abigail Schreier.
Was it her book?
Yeah, it was her book. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that what would happen if some major company or an institution like NYU just said, thanks for tweeting, but we're going to keep doing things our way. I think that they're running scared because they mistake Twitter for reality, but isn't that true for all of us?
Right.
The same way that somebody
All right. So I want to connect that. I think you're exactly right. And look, as a very online person myself, guilty. I love Twitter. It's my drug of choice. And in part for me is I live up in Rhode Island. I live and teach at a boarding school, and I'm away from my friends in Louisiana. I'm away from my family in Louisiana. My friends in California. My friends in Chicago. My friends all around. And so I am a kind of an online guy. And Twitter is, I love it because I want to hear what people are talking about. It's a sort of a FOMO thing, and yet, the outsized influence of a relatively minuscule footprint is strange. And I kind of want to connect that to what you were talking about earlier with Alul's concept of a political illusion. I mean, how does Twitter play into this idea of political illusion? Is that too much of a stretch, or what do you think about that?
Well, let me approach it this way. In the book business, we have to know about social media habits to sell books. It turns out, and I don't know how these numbers are from 2 or 3 years ago, but I imagine they haven't changed a lot. Most people buy books, or most books that are purchased through social media come from Facebook.
Interesting.
But most people in the media and in adjacent, academia, adjacent professions are on Twitter. Facebook is the medium of the masses. But it's something that people like me, I don't use Facebook, and I got off of it before it was cool to be off Facebook, just because I just wasn't interested in it. But I have to follow Twitter because my people, my professional contacts are on Twitter. But if we are we become siloed, being part of the media and part of academia, that sort of thing. We become siloed, and our reality is Twitter. People in our professions care more about what's said on Twitter than what is said on Facebook, even though Facebook is by far the more popular social medium. So to come back to your point, I think that not only do we have a political illusion, but the illusion within the illusion is something that is organized or the bounds are set by the particular kind of media that the cultural elite pay attention to. And it is so hard to get people to understand, get normies to understand how important the New York Times is. I deal with this in my blog a lot. People are like, who cares
Why
what
are you
the
reading
New York
about
Times is? I'm like, I'll tell you who cares. The people who run the newsrooms in your local media, they care about it. The people who run your colleges and the other institutions. It is impossible. Look what happened over the holidays, or just before the holidays. Conservatives have tried for years to get to go after Pornhub.
This is amazing. This is an amazing story. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Nicholas Kristof, the left-wing columnist.
One column.
Yeah, one column at the New York Times writes criticizing Pornhub, and it moves things.
Like literally moved the needle. Incredible.
God bless Nicholas Kristof for writing that column, but this is the power of the New York Times. Even in an era when old-fashioned media doesn't have the power it used to have, it's still really powerful because it speaks to the elites.
Right. That they recognized in that article that they didn't have any kind of moral terra firma to argue against Kristof's point, because number one, he's one of them. An elite. Number two, he specifically, if you recall in the piece, said, "Look, I'm not anti-porn."
Yeah.
He framed it in such a way that this was about trafficking, I believe, right, and rape.
Yeah.
And the argument that I believe Pornhub was sort of replete with rape, videos of rape, etc., or non-consensual recordings and all that sort of stuff, and that moved the needle. So no, I think that's a great example, Rod, of there are lots of sort of sub-irrealities within online spaces, right? And so, in our particular tribes, as sort of social and religious conservatives, there are certain realities that exist on Twitter and Facebook that the rank and file just aren't participating in, and so I always have to remind myself that I know a lot of stuff, but I know stuff about a very sort of uniquely almost irrelevant speck, and so my question then for you as someone who is you blog the culture. I mean, that's what you do. That's your niche. That's what you spend your day doing. I mean, how do you, guard against sort of tempest in a teapot type situations?
This is such a difficult thing to think about because, we're arguing two things here. One, that a lot of this stuff really doesn't matter to the outside world, but also that it does matter. Because these spikes that happen within elite circles eventually do have some impact on the outside world. And, it's weird. I was given a talk up in Nashville earlier this fall and last fall. And I met a guy, a Protestant pastor from a mega church in Portland, Oregon. And he said, I'm glad to meet you. Said, when the Benedict option came out 3 years ago, I can remember, he said, a lot of us were like, oh, Dreher's such an alarmist. Where's that coming? Yeah. And he said, and now the things you were saying back then, that's just our reality. Yeah. I want to thank you for saying it early. Well, timing is everything. I was glad to be that my work was of some use to him. Yeah. But I'm getting some of the same stuff now with Live Not by Lies. People are like, oh, it's alarmist. I think that because I pay attention to the things I do, it's not that I'm any sort of, have any sort of vision. It's just I pay attention to certain things and certain sources and certain patterns. Yeah. And it's important that I pay attention to that because the stuff that happens within these elite circles now is going to move the needle 4 or 5 years from now, in the same way that what happens in California today is going to happen to the rest of America in the coming years. So it's a difficult thing not to know when the thing I'm paying attention to that seems like such a boutique issue that, really this is something that's going to matter to all of us one day. And when it's just about, tempest in a teapot, as you say. I wish I had a better metaphor for that. But this is something that you've seen a lot, Kale, too, and because you follow Catholic blogs a lot. I can remember when I was a Catholic, if I would go out and give speeches in different places, I would often be shocked by how little average church-going Catholics knew about these things that were just consuming the online blogosphere, the left versus right or intra-conservative Catholic fights. And it didn't matter to most people. And it just shocked me because I thought everybody knows this.
I've caught myself in similar situations, and like, especially following a lot of this woke stuff, I've done a big deep dive into source materials and following all of these arguments. And I forget, and then you'll sort of come across someone and it's like, well, why don't you want, if I'm come out, let's say about I'm against critical race theory or something like that. And I'll forget that people in the world, the normie land, as we've joked before, people will just say, oh, well, why don't you want to have like conversations about racism, Kale? It's like, well, that's not what I'm talking about. But thank you for reminding me that I'm so deep into the weeds with critical race theory and what it means and what are the sort of the deep implications that I've lost the sense of what the main line is really dealing with. So.
And, it's interesting you bring that up because when I ended up writing on my blog about what was happening at LSU. And I broke that story because a professor leaked it to me. And it got passed around on a lot of LSU blogs, and the local newspaper here in Baton Rouge had to write about it. And the guy who wrote the story, I mean, the way he framed it, it was kind of that way that, like, these people are concerned. They don't want to talk about race, and LSU has a history of racism and all that. They were totally framing it in a way that I think is fundamentally incorrect. But I assumed when I first read it, well, everybody can see this is a fraudulent way of framing it. But in fact, no. And that's why it's important for people like us to keep this in mind.
No, and I have to continually remind myself that the way to talk about this thing is not to sort of be a sort of snarky Twitter player, and I'm guilty of that. That actually I need to be kind of a little bit more fundamental about it, maybe a little bit more throat clearing. I don't know if that resonates with you, but I'm struck. You talk about, you had conversations with an evangelical pastor from the Pacific Northwest. And just so our audience knows, I'm a Roman Catholic, cradle Catholic, left the church as an angry teenager and came back sometime in young adulthood. You, Rod, you grew up a Methodist, became Catholic, and through your coverage of the abuses in the Catholic Church and the cover-up, you left and have been part of the Orthodox Church for about a decade now, right?
16 years.
Yeah.
How many years? 14 years.
14 years.
Sorry.
So 14 years, and so so you oftentimes in your blog you talk about small O Orthodox Christians, and so I like the fact that you and I both bring our respective confessions perspective to the table here for this podcast. But what do you make? I'm again, it's like I know you, and so when I read your blog and I read your books, I don't know if I read it in your voice, but I'm always surprised with the way, not so much that like left Catholic and left Protestant and left Orthodox people receive you, but I'm more struck and dumbfounded by the way that conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants and conservative Orthodox folks treat your work or receive your work. And have you thought much about that, or how much do you think about that when you sit down to write your next thing?
That's a really good question. I mean, one thing that I've consistently noticed over the years is that people, when they meet me in person, they're surprised that I'm actually a lot more chill than they thought from reading my writing. And I have a good way of compartmentalizing. Like when I sit down to write about the culture war or whatever, I'm not a cynic. I don't write and big broad strokes just to get clicks. I really do mean that stuff. But it's also I can separate real life from these things. And I can understand why people feel that way, because I do write very vividly, especially when I feel passionate about something.
Right.
But it's like Flannery O'Connor said, when people are deaf, you have to shout. And some of the things that really exercise me in the sense of, making me really full of energy are things that I'm trying to get my own side to see that we don't see. And so there's that part of it. But, it's also, I think that there's something about my having left the Catholic Church that really upsets a lot of Catholic people,
Sure.
Conservative Catholic people.
And just to interrupt here real quick, sorry, but, just from a demographic standpoint, that they would comprise a larger part of your audience just by the fact that there are more Catholics in the country than Orthodox, for sure. Yeah. So,
yeah. Yeah, and I've thought, even though I've written very favorably after I left the Catholic Church, I've written very favorably about the Catholic Church. I, wrote about the monks of Nortchen, the Benedict option. I dedicate my new book to a heroic Catholic priest. But I think that there's a certain kind of conservative Catholic who's very online and always male, who can't let it go, the fact that I left the church. And part of me wonders if there's not inside them a fear that, well, if it happened to him, he was such a strong conservative Catholic and he lost the faith. If it happened to him, it might happen to me. So we've got to demonize him. And it doesn't hurt me. I mean, and not because I'm particularly virtuous. It's just that I kind of feel sorry for people like that, because I was that guy at one point. And there are some super conservative Orthodox who are mad at me too, because I won't take the sort of super combative, we've got to throw down and fight with the liberals and fight with the non-Orthodox about this. That's just not who I am, and not who I want to be. I was more like that earlier in my life, but they feel like I'm in some way not being as good an Orthodox as I'm supposed to be by not taking on all these fights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that the nets of tribalism, are always plotting to snare us. That tribalism seems to be the ever-present danger, because when we retreat to our tribes, the first casualty seems to be truth.
Sure.
And I think in large part the reason why you got so destroyed by your work was confronting a group of powerful people who were more concerned about power than truth, which is a dissonance,
Well, not only that, but confronting a large mass of people, the Catholic laity, who are more concerned about preserving their sense of inner peace than the truth, and protecting children, and I think that was something that I really had to struggle with. But we go hearing you talk about tribalism makes me realize that we go back to the political illusion.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Politics within the church, right? And within the church, it's not just the Catholic Church. And I can remember when I first became a Catholic back in the 90s and was really involved in inter-church politics. And man, I could tell you who the good bishops were, the bad bishops, and all that. And the Catholic Church didn't teach me this. I taught myself this, and the peers I was hanging out with, we were all very political Catholics. And we thought that the future of the church depended on getting our people in place as bishops, and getting and it was we were very sincere about this. And I'm not saying that this would have been a bad thing, but look how much good it did. In many cases, John Paul and Benedict appointed bishops who weren't that great. But the thing that was so devastating is my belief that the future of the church and the future of myself as a Christian depended on church politics. Now, if you had asked me back then, do you really believe that? I'm like, of course not. I'm not. What do you take me for? But that's exactly what I believe. I think that's exactly what a lot of very online Christians of whatever church believe.
Why do you think we default to that, Rod? I mean, you and I are both professing and passionate Christians. I mean, I mean, I'm motivated by this. I know you're motivated by this. It's not just politics for either of us. But what do you think motivates? Why do we default to that? Like, why is that where we go?
Well, I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that we live in liquid modernity, as Zygmunt Bauman called it.
Can you talk a little bit about liquid modernity? Because
Sure.
I think that's important for this podcast.
Sure. Yeah, that's a theme that I write about a lot. There was this sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman. He died a couple of years ago. He was a Marxist. And he had this theory of history. He said that, back in the Industrial Revolution, the rate of social change became such that things were moving faster than they ever had before because of the economy and because of technology. But they were still moving slowly enough where people could adjust to these big changes.
Okay.
But as we moved into the 20th century, he said the rate got faster and faster and faster till you get to a point now, which he calls liquid modernity, where things are moving so fast that before they have a chance to gel and solidify, they're changing again. And I think that has a lot to do with the sort of thing you're talking about, why we pull so strongly towards tribe, whether it's a racial tribe or tribes within the church, is because we're looking for a sense of identity, of belonging and meaning. We're looking for a solid ground on which to stand.
So why does the solid ground come from tribe? I mean, and maybe there's not an answer to this. I'm struck by this because I see it over and over and over again. There's a sort of, there's a kind of a retreat to, it's almost more clan than tribe, but maybe it's the same thing. I don't know.
Well, because you always draw back to the people that you trust. I mean, I was talking to my son yesterday. He's in college, and we were talking about, well, what happens if things get really bad in this country? Where do we go?
Right.
I said, well, we go to St. Francisville, the little town in Louisiana where I'm from. He's like, but nobody knows us there. I said, no, but they know our family there. Yeah. And this is something that's so hard for him to understand because he's so young.
Well, also, Rod, really to be fair too, I mean, he's lived in New York, he's lived in Dallas, he's lived in Philadelphia, he's lived in Star Hill, he's lived in Baton Rouge. He hopped in the way that you and I didn't hop, right?
Right. That's true. But I think it's, he hasn't lived long enough, and I would have answered the same way at his age. He hasn't lived long enough to understand how deep this stuff goes. And even though, I may not be particularly known there, my family is, there are people there who have those long memories, who will open the door for us. We're not strangers, even though he's got the last name Dreher. He's not a stranger there for that reason. And right. I think that we're going to, he's talked about how he wants to live in Europe and work in Europe, and I honor that. I'm going to try to help him do that if he wants to. But I said, look, don't you think that if things got bad in the UK or wherever you were living, that you'd better get out of there because people are going to revert to tribe? Because in times of fear, it's got to be evolutionary. You just go with what you know.
Yeah, it's got to be.
The
right.
people who understand you and you understand them.
Yeah, the image that keeps coming into my head as we're talking right now is blood. Tribe and blood. And of course, we're talking about violence. We're talking about the implicit threat of violence, and what do you do when things go really bad? And I, for some reason, I've been thinking a lot about. Just today, and I know this, I'm throwing you a curveball here, so apologies in advance, but I've been thinking a lot about Walker Percy, and he seemed to see this, I'm thinking of Love in the Ruins, he seemed to kind of see through all of the fog, he's writing this stuff in the late 70s, early 80s, I guess. I'm not sure. I'm going to get somebody zing me on this one, but that's fine. Yeah. But that the ruin, that we seem to be flirting with, and I wanted to bring this to one of your blog posts the other day. Jeremiah was a bourgeois, and of course, if you don't know Louisiana, you say bourgeois the way you say bullfrog, right? It sort of worked in that Louisiana cadence, but you do tend to write in in the mode, right? I mean, that is your mode, at least as far as I can tell, is a kind of reluctant, obviously, a reluctant would-be Jeremiah. And that's kind of what I'm getting at with this, the way in which, evangelical and Catholic and Orthodox media feel you or don't, as it were. That they're never, I can't imagine anybody ever like looking forward to hearing Jeremiah.
No, they don't. And I think what it is, Kale, is they don't. I hesitate to say it because I don't understand. Like I'm tooting my own horn here, but it's just human. It's just human nature. I learned this from writing about the Catholic scandal. I thought people would want to hear, "Hey, this stuff is really happening. We've got to run out and fix it and all that." But it turns out they actually don't. And I think that's true about a lot of things. And people don't.
Were you surprised by this, Rod? I mean, I've always wanted to ask you this question. You were on the beat. I mean, you were a young, fired up JP2 Catholic convert, and you were covering this, and you were making your way in the world in New York City. Were you surprised by this?
By what, the people didn't want to know?
Yeah. They don't. I don't want you. You're talking, but I don't want to hear a thing you're saying.
Yeah. I honest to God, I was, because I was younger then, and I did not realize the power of denial, and how people were just, look, good novelists could have told me this, but, and I began to see this over and over again once I got acclimated to, but it was able to see how people really didn't want to know the truth about things. Look, conservative Catholics were happy to know the truth about all the liberal Catholics.
Like Rembert Weakland, for instance.
Right.
Love that. Yeah.
Yeah, but they didn't want to hear that Father Benedict Groeschel was not who he was their hero. And I'm not saying he was an abuser, but he did play a role in recycling abusers through his
ministry,
his psychological
ministry.
Yeah. And so, look, I look back now and think, how could I possibly have been so naive? But I was a true believer, and I really, and as a journalist too, I believe that if you could just inform people about what's going on in the world, where the problems are, then they will naturally rise up and fix it. But that's actually not true. And I think we've seen this happen even more. Hannah Arendt says that a pre-totalitarian society is one in which people don't even make a pretense anymore of trying to discover the truth. They just want to listen to what makes them feel good. And we have seen this on the left, we've seen this on the right, and I think it's going to a really bad place. So what happened? I was talking to my son about this the other day, about why the New Yorker magazine, New Yorker cartoons have gotten so bad, and comedy is so bad in the Trump era, because you can't parody him.
Yeah.
there's the sort of things that would have been a Saturday Night Live skit. This is reality.
It's real life. Right.
Yeah, and that's on Trump, but I think just in general now, the expectation people have of that once we learn the truth, it will set us free from all the things that afflict us. I think most people now don't really believe that anymore. I think they think that the truth is just a take.
Yeah, God, that's exactly right. I'm in my sort of, just watching the scene, right? I'm fascinated to watch this kind of realignment going on, with people who seem to actually believe in the honest pursuit of truth, be the details damned, right? Be the dress, however you dress it, all that stuff, all those those pre-commitments, right? That there are some people who are genuinely motivated to seek out truth. And there seem to be people who are who will give lip service to, I believe in the truth, until it runs afoul of my ambition, or till it runs afoul of my sacred cows. And that's kind of what I'm getting at with the Christian response to, for instance, Live Not by Lies. you know, I'm, you know, that it, you know, look, that's the name of your book, right? I mean, the whole point of
Right,
the
right,
book
right.
is that this stuff runs right through me, not over there and over there and over there, but right through
Mm-hmm.
me. And we're seeing people treat it as if, like, well, you know, Rod's really, you know, and they're doing this sort of this weird trying to guess at what you're really talking about, and you're like, no, I'm really talking about
No,
this. Like,
I mean what I say, and
yeah,
it's
yeah, like
and,
this is what I
and it's
actually
a defense.
mean, you know.
Yeah, it's a defense mechanism, because if I'm right, and it's not just me, if the people I'm quoting in there, the people who came through communism, if they're right, then we are in trouble, and we had better start changing the way we as the church approach our own daily lives in dramatic ways. Well, nobody wants to hear that. And I say nobody. The book is selling pretty well, and some people want to hear it. But we were told it was going to be this way. That
What do you mean by that?
I think. Well, what I mean by that is that this is how it always happens with the prophets.
Right.
And I hesitate to call myself a prophet, and I'm not. But just say people who say things that nobody wants to hear. They're not popular. And
Right.
but there are some people who, I was talking today to a guy, a LDS guy, Mormon guy, who said that your stuff is really popular among Mormons because some of our leaders are taking it seriously. That they see what's happening now in the broader culture,
Wow.
and they know that it's going to be a hard row for Christians to hoe, and they're trying to prepare us. So I'm like, well, this is news to me. I'm glad to hear it because this is not a popular message because people don't want the implications of the message are too scary for people. But
think about that, Rod. I mean, think about that. Like from an institutional level, the institutional failure to posit truth as the North Star, right? That thing by which we navigate, establish mission, deliver mission. If you're true, if you're correct, if your sort of assessment of the situation is correct, like this is a damning message.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And mistakes were made.
Well, and look, I'm not letting myself free here too.
Yeah,
we
no, I know.
all want to believe that as Americans, we want to believe there's a happy ending, that
Amen.
everything is going to be wrapped up by the third act, and go to commercial.
Yeah.
But I've learned in my life, and you've read my books, that it doesn't always work out that way. And that, we as Americans, and this is something we're running out of time now, but this is something for a future podcast, the whole idea of the tragic sense.
Yeah.
We are not a tragic people. We don't think.
That's so true. The thing about we Americans is we don't understand the tragedy, which is interesting, right? I mean, and I'm a literature teacher, and yet arguably our finest novel, or one of our finest novels, Moby Dick, is a tragedy. It's in the tragic mode, and so there's this haunting. Melville was, good American, good solid wasp stock, and all that, but he saw the tragic mode. And we treat Moby Dick as one of the great American novels now, but it was completely ignored and destroyed his career when it was published in 1851. He never recovered from his desire to share the tragic vision. Because before that, he's a sort of an action adventure writer, super popular. He's writing the Indiana Jones movies, novels of his time. He decides he's going to do something real. And basically he's downloading Lear and he's downloading the King James Bible. And nobody wants to hear it. Tell me lies, man. That's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear this tragic business. And boy, I really would like to go back to this idea of tragedy, because I do think that it's this weird thing that we just don't seem to have a stomach for.
No. And, I've been thinking about this lately, and I know we're running out of time, but maybe people will come back to hear us talk about this on a future edition. the way our inability to understand tragedy, it's gotten even worse now in the era of wokeness, because now we are being compelled to erase from history anything to do with the Confederacy. And my ancestors fought for the Confederacy, and I'm glad the Confederacy lost. Don't get me wrong there, but the tragedy of these people giving their lives in some cases for a bad cause. Yeah. And that is such a human story.
It's so necessary. It's Faulkner. I mean, this is the thing. Faulkner, one of my lodestars. You can't teach him anymore. I mean, he's talking about you joke from time to time on your blog about the long defeat. I mean, there's no greater poet of the long defeat than William Faulkner, and you can't teach him now.
Yeah, and this is a question you could answer better than I could, and I would love to know what that is going to do to us as a culture and as a nation if we can no longer bear tragedy and irony.
Well, I'll quote Macbeth for you. It will have blood, they said. Blood will have blood. It'll come, Rod. You can only stave it off for so long. Blood will have blood. I mean, it's just there's no way around it. We're not the miracles of history that we get to escape tragedy. Absolutely not. We kid ourselves.
I was just before we came on this podcast, I was texting with a friend of mine who's a Democrat, is involved in Democratic Party politics.
Yeah. In the state or nationally or?
Nationally.
Yeah.
He was, we were just talking about how racial conflict and the way it plays out in politics. And my friend is a man of color, but he was saying, white people in this country aren't wrong to think that they're being demographically gentrified out of power.
Sure.
And we were talking about too, again, this man is a Democrat and he's a really smart guy. And, but we were talking about how, I told him, I think future historians will look back on this era and wonder what in the world were they thinking in America when just at the time when it was going into this time of great demographic transition, when it was no longer going to be dominated by one particular race, it was going to be more pluralistic. Why in God's name did they focus on identity politics and heightening the differences rather than doubling down on old-fashioned liberalism, like we can all be part of one nation, because that's the only way you can live peaceably. That's so not true. What's happening.
That's so true. And we can end here, and we'll set up next episode. So we got things to do here, but both of us grew up in the South, and both of us grew up in the very recent wake of Jim Crow South. And what's so difficult, when I hear people, especially up here in New England, right, that racism is systemic and is endemic and it's so bad, and it's like, I want to say, man, I would love to jump in a time machine and take you back to my childhood. You want to see racism? You want to see that kind of casual, just, straight up race, come on back, and then of course my mom and dad will say, you want to see racism, Kale? Why don't you come on back to when I was a kid?
And they're right. They're right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But you can't say that, right now, like that is, like, I'm not allowed to say, that we actually have made some incredible progress in this liberal project.
What? Why won't progressives believe in progress? It's a weird thing if you think about it.
That's good. Yeah. That's great.
No, but it really is weird that, they have to believe somehow that this is the worst of all possible times, when in fact, we're never going to get to utopia, but in fact, things are just incomparably better than they were when our parents were small, on the racial front at least.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, and the fact that in 1991, when I graduated high school in Baton Rouge, that I could, with some raised eyebrows, bring a black girl home, to meet mom and dad, is a miracle. Mm-hmm. It's a miracle, a cultural miracle, and the fact that I can have, people in my extended family who are, as a a black husband and a white wife. Like it's a miracle, and it's a good
Yeah.
thing, and
Yeah. It was unthinkable growing up in
totally,
a small town where I did
totally,
in the 70s.
totally, yeah. So, all right, well, that's enough of a walk down memory lane for two Southern boys, one back home and one a continual inner emigre, as Seamus Heaney would call it. So, well, look, thank you, Rod. This has been great. Hopefully, we'll get to keep doing this together. We hope to record these early in the week and release them on Friday mornings. We enjoy talking about all kinds of things, culture and politics, and we hope to talk about food and music because those are two things that are close to our heart. But we'd ask you, of course, to do all the normal things, to like this podcast and subscribe, hit the like and subscribe buttons, and even the notifications if you can bring yourself to do it. This apparently, from what they tell me, will help others find the podcast. And of course, a positive review, if you're so inclined, would also be super helpful. You can find Rod at his blog at The American Conservative, and now at his daily Dreher Substack, roddreher.substack.com. You can find me, for what it's worth, on twitter.com. And we look forward to seeing you, or we look forward to you hearing us on Fridays each and every week. Thank you so much.
Yeah, like my Uncle Bubba back in Star Hill used to say, don't get nothing on you.
All right, Rod, thank you so much. Have a great one. All right.